Welcome to Chosen by Love, where fate brings hearts together in the most unexpected ways. Subscribe and join our growing family of story lovers. Tell us where you're watching from, and let's begin today's journey. If the first thing you notice about someone is the mud on their shoes, you might miss the greatness in their heart. The rain had finally slowed, but downtown Chicago still looked as if the sky had emptied every cloud it had been saving for months. Water streamed along the curbs, headlights shimmered across the soaked streets, and people hurried beneath black umbrellas, determined not to let a storm interfere with their carefully planned mornings. Inside the towering glass headquarters of Whitmore Dynamics, the lobby gleamed with polished marble floors that reflected every crystal light hanging from the 30-foot ceiling. Men in tailored navy suits adjusted their silk ties while women in elegant business dresses reviewed resumes on expensive tablets. Every candidate looked prepared for the opportunity of a lifetime. Every candidate except one. At exactly 8:57 a.m., the revolving door spun open with a rush of damp air, and a young woman stumbled inside, breathing hard. Her blonde hair clung to the sides of her face in loose, rain-soaked strands. Brown mud splattered the bottom half of her cream-colored blouse. Her dark blue skirt was streaked with dirt nearly to the knees, and one of her low heels carried enough dried clay to leave faint footprints across the immaculate marble floor. Conversations stopped. Several applicants exchanged uncomfortable glances. One quietly stepped away, as though afraid the mud might somehow spread onto his polished leather shoes. Elena Mercer paused just inside the entrance, trying to catch her breath while brushing at the stains with trembling hands. It was hopeless. Every attempt only smeared the mud even farther across the fabric. She closed her eyes for a brief second. She had spent 3 weeks preparing for this interview. 3 weeks studying annual reports, memorizing company values, researching every executive she might meet. None of that preparation had included arriving looking like she'd climbed out of a flooded cornfield. The receptionist looked up from her computer, forcing a professional smile that quickly faded. "Ma'am, are you here for the executive development interview?"
Elena nodded.
"Yes.
I'm Elena Mercer."
The woman hesitated before glancing down at the marble floor. "I'm sorry, but our executive board is already assembled. This is a very formal interview process."
Elena swallowed.
"I know." The receptionist lowered her voice. "Perhaps it would be better if you rescheduled." Around the lobby, a few candidates pretended not to listen while clearly listening to every word. Someone whispered just loudly enough to be heard. "There's no way they're letting her upstairs looking like that." Another chuckled softly. Maybe she thought this was a landscaping job. Elena heard every syllable. Her cheeks warmed with embarrassment, but she didn't argue. She simply reached into her worn leather tote, carefully removed a neatly protected resume inside a plastic folder, and held it close against her chest as though it were the only clean thing she still possessed. Before she could respond, a calm male voice interrupted from behind. "May I ask what happened?" The lobby turned toward the speaker. Standing beside one of the tall windows was a man in a simple charcoal button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms. No expensive watch flashed beneath the lights. No designer suit announced authority. He looked more like a senior consultant than someone important enough to command attention. His blue eyes rested on Elena without a trace of judgment. Graham Whitmore had entered through a private side entrance nearly 10 minutes earlier, intending to quietly observe the candidates before the interviews began. He had built a billion-dollar company by trusting character more than appearances, and mornings like this often revealed more than any resume ever could. None of the applicants recognized him. Even most new employees wouldn't have. Graham preferred it that way. Elena looked at the stranger for only a moment before lowering her eyes again. "It's a long story," she answered softly. "I know how this looks." The receptionist folded her hands. "Unfortunately, appearances do matter during executive interviews."
Elena nodded slowly.
"They do." She took one careful breath before lifting her head again. There wasn't a hint of self-pity in her expression anymore. Only quiet determination. "But I hope they won't matter more than honesty." For the first time that morning, Graham's expression changed. It wasn't surprise. It was curiosity. Across the lobby, the elevator doors slid open as another executive stepped out, glanced toward the muddy footprints stretching across the marble floor, then frowned. Who approved letting her inside? Silence settled over the lobby like another passing storm. Every eye turned toward Elena, waiting to see whether she would apologize, leave, or break under the weight of a room that had already decided exactly who she was. Elena did not lower her eyes this time. She looked at the executive who had questioned her presence, then at the muddy footprints behind her, and finally back at the receptionist whose expression had shifted from polite concern to quiet uncertainty. "If you believe I cannot represent your company because of what happened this morning," she said gently, "I will understand. But I would rather be rejected for my abilities than for circumstances you have not heard." Her voice never rose above a calm conversation, yet somehow every person in the lobby heard every word. The executive crossed his arms. "Circumstances?"
Elena nodded.
"Yes, sir." Before she could continue, Graham spoke in the same even tone he had used from the beginning. "I think we have 2 minutes to hear them." The executive glanced at him briefly, assuming he was another senior employee. "This interview schedule is already behind." Graham offered a faint smile. "Then 2 minutes will not change very much." The receptionist looked uncertain before quietly stepping back from the counter. Elena took a slow breath, still clutching her resume. "I left my apartment before 6 this morning because I wanted to be early. My car stopped running 3 miles from here, so I parked it and started walking. Nobody interrupted. About 40 minutes later I reached the old bridge on Halstead Street. A pickup truck had slipped halfway into a drainage ditch because of the rain. The driver was an older man. He kept trying to push it out by himself." One candidate quietly rolled his eyes as if expecting an excuse. Elena continued anyway. "I could have kept walking. Honestly, I thought about it. This interview means everything to me." But he was alone. Graham watched her carefully. She never exaggerated. She never searched the room for sympathy. She simply stated facts. "The mud was almost up to my ankles. We pushed for nearly 15 minutes before another driver stopped to help. Once the truck was free, I thought I could still make it." She glanced down at her shoes with an embarrassed smile. "Then I heard a dog crying." Several people exchanged puzzled looks. Elena laughed softly at herself. "I know how ridiculous that sounds." Graham shook his head. "Go on." A small golden retriever had become tangled in a broken garden fence beside the sidewalk. It was frightened because of the thunder. I climbed through the mud to untangle the leash. One of the younger applicants frowned. "You are saying you ruined your interview clothes because of a dog?" Elena looked toward him. "Because it needed help." Silence followed. She continued quietly. "After that, I was almost here when I saw an elderly woman standing outside the bus stop without an umbrella. The wind had turned her grocery bag over, and everything rolled into the street." She smiled faintly, remembering. "The tomatoes did not survive. A few people chuckled despite themselves. We gathered everything else together. She kept apologizing for delaying me. I told her she did not owe me an apology." The executive who had questioned her earlier remained unconvinced. "You expect us to believe all of this happened in one morning?" Elena answered immediately. "No, sir. I do not expect you to believe anything. I was only answering the question." There was no defensiveness in her voice, only honesty. Graham noticed something that no one else seemed to see. Every time she spoke about helping someone, her expression softened naturally. But every time the conversation returned to herself, she became uncomfortable. That difference could not be rehearsed, could only be genuine. Upstairs, several security monitors continuously recorded every entrance surrounding the building. Graham suddenly remembered that Whitmore Dynamics' exterior security system covered several blocks surrounding headquarters. He wondered whether Elena's walk had been captured there. At the time he had paid little attention. Now curiosity settled firmly in his mind. The executive sighed impatiently. "Whether your story is true or not, executive positions require preparation. Preparation includes arriving presentable."
Elena nodded.
"You are right." She surprised everyone by agreeing so quickly. "If I had another chance to prepare, I would still leave early. I would still stop. I just wish I had packed another pair of shoes." A quiet laugh escaped the receptionist before she quickly covered her mouth. Even Graham smiled. It was the first genuine smile he had allowed himself all morning. He had interviewed thousands of ambitious people over the years. Many knew exactly what to say when opportunity stood in front of them. Very few forgot they were trying to impress anyone at all. As the elevator doors opened once again, Graham slipped his phone from his pocket without drawing attention and sent a brief message to the head of building security. 3 simple words appeared on the screen before he pressed send. Review our security cameras near headquarters. The interview coordinator finally stepped forward with a clipboard pressed against his chest. The morning schedule had already slipped behind, and every executive upstairs was waiting. He cleared his throat before looking at Elena. Miss Mercer, the board will decide whether you continue. Please wait here. He disappeared into the elevator, leaving behind a lobby filled with uncomfortable silence. One by one, the other candidates returned to reviewing their notes, but not a single person actually read another page. Every few seconds someone glanced toward the young woman, whose muddy shoes had somehow become the center of everyone's attention. Elena quietly walked to a nearby chair and sat down. She reached into her bag, removed a folded handkerchief and carefully wiped as much dirt as she could from her hands before smoothing the edges of her resume. She did not complain. She did not make another speech. She simply waited. Graham remained standing near the windows, watching her with growing curiosity. Most people under pressure tried to control how others saw them. Elena seemed interested only in controlling herself. Less than 5 minutes later, the elevator doors opened again. Miss Mercer, the coordinator called. The board has agreed to see you. A ripple of surprise moved through the waiting candidates. Elena stood immediately. Thank you. As she stepped toward the elevator, Graham followed several steps behind. She assumed he worked somewhere inside the company and thought nothing more of it. On the 26th floor, polished oak doors opened into a spacious conference room overlooking the Chicago skyline. Rain still traced gentle lines down the floor-to-ceiling windows while 8 members of the executive hiring committee sat around a long walnut table. Every chair except one was occupied. Elena noticed the empty seat at the far end but assumed another executive had not yet arrived. She stopped beside the chair prepared for candidates. Good morning. Several members answered politely while others focused on the folder containing her resume. One executive adjusted his glasses before speaking first. Miss Mercer, your academic record is impressive. Your recommendations are excellent. Unfortunately, your arrival this morning has already raised concerns regarding judgment and professionalism.
Elena nodded respectfully.
I understand. Another board member leaned forward. You have explained your delay. Whether everyone believes that explanation is another matter. We would rather focus on something else. Elena folded her hands together. Of course. The woman smiled politely. Good. Then let us begin with a simple question. The room became perfectly still. Suppose you walk out of this building today without an offer. What happens next? Elena blinked once. It was not the technical question she expected. There was nothing about business strategy, financial forecasting, or leadership models. Just one quiet question. For a few seconds she looked down at the table, not searching for the perfect answer but searching for the truthful one. Finally she looked back up. I would thank you. A few eyebrows lifted. Then I would probably call the repair shop and ask whether my car is ready. One executive smiled faintly. Elena continued. After that, I would keep applying for jobs until someone gave me a chance to earn one. Another interviewer tilted his head. You would not feel angry? Maybe for a little while, Elena admitted honestly. Disappointed too. I am human. A few members nodded. But disappointment is temporary. Character is supposed to last longer than one interview. The room fell silent again. The executive who had challenged her in the lobby crossed his arms. What if every company rejected you? Elena answered without hesitation. Then I would assume I still had something to learn. I cannot control every decision someone else makes. I can only control the person I become while waiting for the next opportunity. Graham felt something shift inside him. He had heard polished answers from graduates of the finest business schools in the country. Many quoted famous leaders. Many repeated impressive phrases they had memorized from interview books. Elena spoke as someone who had learned those lessons while paying real bills and facing real setbacks. Another board member leaned forward. What motivates you more, success or money?
Elena smiled softly.
Neither. Several people looked surprised. Money solves problems. Success creates opportunities. But neither one tells me whether I have become someone my parents would be proud of. She paused before adding quietly, when I was growing up, my father always said that the easiest thing to lose was your reputation because it usually disappeared one small decision at a time. I have tried very hard not to lose mine. No one spoke for several seconds. Outside the conference room, Graham's phone vibrated gently inside his pocket. The security director had replied with only one sentence. We found the footage you requested. The notification remained on Graham's phone for only a second before he locked the screen and slipped it back into his pocket. He did not allow his expression to change. The interview continued as though nothing had happened. Across the table, Elena answered questions about leadership, budgeting, conflict resolution, and customer trust with the same quiet confidence she had shown from the beginning. She never pretended to know something she did not. When one executive asked about a financial model she had never used, she smiled politely and replied, I have not worked with that system yet, so I would rather learn it properly than pretend I already understand it. One interviewer scribbled something onto his evaluation sheet. Another simply nodded. Graham had spent years watching applicants disguise weakness as confidence. Elena did the opposite. She treated honesty as a strength. After nearly 40 minutes, the committee called for a short recess before the final evaluation. The executives gathered their notes and stepped into an adjoining conference room, leaving Elena alone with a bottle of water at the long table. She slowly exhaled, not realizing she had been holding her breath for almost an hour. Looking down at the muddy edge of her shoe, she gave herself a small, almost amused smile. Well, she whispered to herself, at least you made it this far. A quiet voice answered from behind. You handled yourself better than most people would have. Elena turned and saw the same man from the lobby standing near the coffee station with 2 paper cups in his hands. I hope I am not interrupting, Graham said. The board usually takes about 10 minutes. He walked over and placed 1 cup in front of her. Black coffee, unless you prefer something else. Elena looked surprised. Thank you. That is very kind. You look like you could use it. She wrapped both hands around the warm cup, grateful for the heat more than the coffee itself. For a moment neither of them spoke. Beyond the windows, the rain had softened into a light drizzle, and the city below seemed calmer than it had only an hour earlier. Graham finally broke the silence. Can I ask you something that is not on the interview list?
Elena smiled.
After today, I think I can survive one more question. He returned the smile. Why did you really stop to help those people this morning? She looked genuinely puzzled. Because they needed help. Even though this interview could change your life? Especially because it could. Graham tilted his head slightly. I am not sure I understand. Elena looked out the window before answering. If getting my dream job requires me to ignore someone having a difficult morning, then I would spend every day wondering what kind of employee I had become before I even started. Graham remained silent. She continued quietly. My mother used to tell me something when I was little. She always said that success arrives eventually if it is meant for you. But the opportunity to be kind usually arrives only once. If you miss it, it belongs to somebody else. Graham found himself studying her face instead of preparing another question. There was no performance in her words. She was speaking exactly the way she believed. Do you always trust strangers? He asked.
Elena laughed softly.
Not always. Then how do you decide? She thought for a moment. I pay attention to how people treat someone who cannot do anything for them. Graham looked down at his untouched coffee. Interesting answer.
Elena shrugged gently.
It has saved me from making a few bad decisions. He smiled again. And if this company offered you less money than another employer? She answered almost immediately. I would compare the people before I compared the salary. Really? I have lived with very little money before. It was difficult. But working somewhere that makes you afraid to be yourself every day is another kind of poverty. Graham let those words settle between them. During countless board meetings he had heard consultants speak for hours about corporate culture. Elena had summarized it in a single sentence. Before he could respond, the conference room door opened. One of the interview coordinators stepped inside. "We are ready for the final session." Elena stood, smoothing her still damp skirt as naturally as she could. "Thank you for the coffee." Graham nodded. "You are welcome." As she walked back toward the interview table, she never once wondered why a simple employee seemed unusually interested in her answers. She assumed he was just another member of the staff. Graham remained where he was for another moment before looking once more at the message waiting on his phone. Attached beneath the security director's reply were 3 surveillance clips recorded that very morning. He pressed play on the first video, and within seconds, everything Elena had quietly described began unfolding on the screen exactly as she had said. While the rest of the hiring committee returned to their notes, Graham quietly excused himself for a few minutes and stepped into a private executive office overlooking the city. He placed his phone on the desk and opened the first security recording. Whitmore Dynamics maintained several exterior security cameras covering the streets immediately surrounding headquarters, primarily for employee safety and building security. Graham wanted to know whether any of them had captured Elena's walk toward the office. The timestamp read 6:41 that morning. Rain poured across the empty street as Elena's aging sedan rolled to the shoulder with its hazard lights flashing. The footage showed her stepping out, lifting the hood for less than a minute before shaking her head with a resigned smile. She grabbed her bag, locked the car, and started walking through the rain without a single complaint. Graham watched carefully. There was no audience, no interview panel, no reason for anyone to perform kindness. He opened the second recording. The first 2 clips came from Whitmore Dynamics' exterior security system. The camera overlooking Halstead Street showed a pickup truck tilted awkwardly into a muddy drainage ditch. An older man struggled to push from behind while spinning tires only sprayed more mud across the road. Elena appeared from the corner of the screen, hesitated for barely 2 seconds, then set her bag beneath a bus shelter to keep it dry before stepping directly into ankle-deep mud. Graham noticed the effort on her face as she leaned against the truck beside a complete stranger. Minutes passed before another driver stopped to help. Only after the truck reached solid pavement did Elena retrieve her soaked bag and continue walking. She never accepted the older man's attempt to hand her cash before hurrying away. Graham leaned back in his chair, saying nothing. He pressed play again. The next clip had been provided by the owner of a nearby office building after Whitmore Security requested assistance. The building manager responded immediately after learning the footage might help verify the timeline of a job applicant's morning. A frightened golden retriever had become tangled against a damaged garden fence beside the sidewalk. Cars continued driving past while people hurried beneath umbrellas. Elena stopped once more. Kneeling in the mud, she carefully freed the frightened animal before fastening the loose leash around its collar. Moments later, an elderly woman came running from a nearby porch, embracing the dog with visible relief. Even through silent security footage, gratitude was unmistakable. Elena smiled, waved politely, and continued toward downtown. Graham found himself smiling as well. He moved to the final recording. Outside a neighborhood bus stop, grocery bags had spilled across the wet sidewalk after a sudden gust of wind. Apples rolled into puddles. Cans scattered toward the curb. An elderly woman struggled to gather everything before the traffic light changed. Elena immediately knelt beside her, collecting every item she could reach. Whitmore Security later spoke with the owner of the nearby convenience store, who recognized Elena immediately. The owner explained that after helping the elderly woman, Elena quietly came inside, purchased a replacement package with her own money, and hurried back to return it before continuing to her interview. She never mentioned that part of the story because it had not mattered to her. Graham slowly lowered the phone. His office remained perfectly silent except for the distant sound of rain tapping against the windows. He had spent years creating leadership programs designed to identify integrity before talent. Entire departments analyzed personality assessments, psychological profiles, and behavioral interviews. Yet one ordinary morning had revealed more about Elena Mercer than months of testing ever could. A gentle knock interrupted his thoughts. His executive assistant, Natalie, stepped inside carrying a tablet. "The committee is almost ready to vote," she said. "Would you like the evaluation summaries?" Graham looked up. "Not yet." Natalie noticed the surveillance videos paused on his screen. Something important? Graham nodded once. Very. She waited, knowing he rarely used that tone unless he had already made up his mind about something. Run a background review on Elena Mercer, he said. Not for problems. Natalie looked surprised. Then what should I be looking for? Graham answered quietly. I want to know whether she treats everyone this way, or whether today was unusual. Natalie smiled faintly. You think it was genuine? Graham looked once more at the frozen image of Elena helping the elderly woman gather groceries beneath the rain. No, he replied thoughtfully. I think being genuine is exactly what made it look so ordinary. Less than an hour later, Natalie's preliminary report arrived. There were no disciplinary issues, no lawsuits, no troubling financial history. Instead, there were small, almost forgettable details. She volunteered twice a month at a neighborhood food pantry. She mentored first-generation college students on weekends. 3 former supervisors, contacted separately, all described her using nearly identical words. Dependable, honest, kind under pressure. One handwritten reference from a retired manager ended with a single sentence that caught Graham's attention more than every impressive qualification above it. If I had 100 employees with Elena's character, I would never worry about the future of my business. Graham quietly closed the file, already realizing that the final decision waiting downstairs was about to become much more complicated than anyone on the hiring committee expected. The hiring committee reconvened 10 minutes later, and the atmosphere inside the conference room felt noticeably heavier than before. Elena returned to her chair with the same quiet composure she had carried all morning, although exhaustion had begun to settle behind her eyes. The rain had finally stopped outside and pale sunlight filtered through the clouds, casting soft reflections across the polished conference table. One by one, the executives reviewed their notes. Several had been impressed by her thoughtful answers. Others remained unconvinced. Finally, the chairman folded his hands together. Miss Mercer, thank you for your patience. Before we conclude, we would like to discuss one remaining concern.
Elena nodded.
Of course. The chairman glanced toward another executive, who spoke without hesitation. Your integrity appears genuine. Your recommendations are excellent. However, executive leadership also requires judgment, presentation, and an understanding that perception matters. This morning you arrived looking unprepared for one of the most important opportunities of your career. Elena accepted the criticism without arguing. You are right, she said quietly. Perception does matter. The executive continued. If clients saw one of our future executives arriving in that condition, what conclusion would they reach? Elena thought for a moment before answering. Probably the wrong one. A few people exchanged curious looks. She continued calmly. But I also believe good leaders eventually teach people to look beyond first impressions. Otherwise, we spend our lives rewarding appearances instead of character. Silence followed her words. Before anyone could respond, the conference room door opened. Every executive immediately rose from their seats. Elena looked around in confusion, wondering who had just entered. Then she saw him. The man who had shared coffee with her only minutes earlier walked calmly into the room, no longer dressed like an unnoticed employee. His assistant followed a respectful distance behind, carrying a tablet and several folders. The chairman smiled warmly. Good afternoon, Mr. Whitmore.
Elena blinked.
Her eyes moved from one standing executive to another before settling back on Graham. Nobody remained seated except her. Realization slowly spread across her face. Graham Whitmore walked to the empty chair at the head of the table and placed a folder neatly in front of him. Please, he said gently. Everyone may sit. Elena remained frozen for another second before quietly lowering herself back into her chair. Her heartbeat seemed louder than the room itself. The kind man from the lobby, the one who had offered coffee and listened without judgment, had not been another employee. He had been the billionaire founder and chief executive officer of Whitmore Dynamics all along. Graham noticed the surprise in her expression and offered the same calm smile she had seen downstairs. Miss Mercer, I owe you an apology. She looked at him, still trying to process what had happened. An apology? I introduced myself poorly this morning. A few members of the committee laughed softly. Elena managed a small smile despite her confusion. I suppose we both made assumptions today. Graham nodded. That seems fair. He folded his hands together before addressing the entire room. I have listened carefully to today's interview. I have also reviewed additional information gathered this morning. Several executives exchanged puzzled glances. The chairman frowned slightly. Additional information? Graham nodded once. Yes. Before this committee reaches a final decision, Graham said calmly, I asked our security department to verify something that may be relevant to today's discussion. He connected his tablet to the large presentation screen mounted on the wall behind him. The room darkened slightly as the first surveillance image appeared. Elena immediately recognized the familiar intersection where her car had broken down. Her eyes widened. The second clip followed, showing her helping the stranded driver push his truck free from the muddy ditch. Nobody spoke. The third recording showed her kneeling beside the frightened golden retriever in the pouring rain. Then came the final video of her gathering groceries with the elderly woman, while quietly replacing the damaged package she had purchased herself. The room remained completely silent until the screen faded to black. Graham looked slowly around the conference table before speaking. This company invests millions of dollars every year searching for people with leadership potential. He paused, allowing every word to settle. Leadership is not revealed during perfect mornings. It reveals itself when everything goes wrong and someone still chooses to put another person's needs ahead of convenience. The executive who had questioned Elena in the lobby lowered his eyes toward the table. Another quietly closed his evaluation folder without saying a word. Elena herself stared at the blank screen, unaware that her ordinary morning had just become the most important interview presentation no applicant had ever planned to give. No one reached for a pen. No one shuffled another page of notes. The conference room, which had been filled with confident opinions only minutes earlier, now sat in complete silence. Elena looked down at her folded hands, wishing the attention would move away from her. She had never helped those strangers expecting recognition. In fact, seeing those moments projected across a 40-inch screen in front of a room full of executives felt strangely uncomfortable. Graham noticed her reaction immediately. She was not smiling with pride. She looked almost embarrassed. That told him even more than the videos had. He stood slowly and rested one hand on the back of his chair. Miss Mercer, he began, do you know why I asked security to retrieve those recordings? Elena shook her head. No, Mr. Whitmore. Because resumes tell me what people have done. They rarely tell me who they are. Today yours did. Graham pressed a button on the remote, and the image of Elena pushing the stranded pickup truck appeared once more. He paused the video at the moment she leaned against the muddy tailgate. This woman believed she was risking the most important interview of her life. He looked toward the committee. She stopped anyway. Graham let the final image remain on the screen. No one spoke. She believed nobody would ever know, he said quietly. That is exactly why it matters. The executive who had questioned Elena throughout the morning slowly removed his glasses. I owe Miss Mercer an apology. He turned toward her with genuine sincerity. I judged your professionalism before I understood your priorities. I was wrong.
Elena smiled gently.
She looked almost uncomfortable receiving so much attention. You were doing your job. No, he replied softly. I forgot part of it. Another committee member spoke next. I have interviewed executives for 23 years. I cannot remember the last time I changed my opinion this completely during a single meeting. The chairman leaned back in his chair with a thoughtful expression. Neither can I. Graham looked toward Elena once again. Earlier someone asked what clients would think if they saw one of our executives arriving covered in mud. He paused. I have a different question. His eyes moved across the room. How many clients would trust a company more after learning exactly why she arrived that way? Nobody answered because the answer had become obvious. Graham continued quietly. Business is built on competence. Great companies are built on trust. Elena finally spoke. Mr. Whitmore. He looked at her. Yes. I appreciate everything you have said today. More than I know how to express. But I hope nobody believes I deserve special treatment because of this morning. Several executives looked surprised. Elena continued. Helping people does not make me exceptional. It is simply something I hope I would never stop doing. Graham smiled. That is exactly why this conversation matters. Graham looked around the room before turning back to Elena. All morning we have been asking whether you belong here. He smiled gently. Now I think the better question is whether we deserve someone like you. Elena blinked, unable to answer. Her eyes glistened slightly, but she quickly composed herself. Graham reached for a slim folder resting beside him. Miss Mercer, before this meeting ends, I have one final decision to share. Every member of the committee turned toward him. Even the chairman looked curious, unaware of exactly what Graham intended to announce. Elena sat quietly, her muddy shoes still visible beneath the conference table, completely unaware that the next few moments were about to change not only her career, but the direction of both their lives. For a long moment, Elena simply looked at the folder in Graham's hands. She had walked into Whitmore Dynamics hoping only for the chance to compete fairly. She had never imagined the conversation would end like this. Graham opened the folder and slid a single document across the polished table. Miss Mercer, he said warmly, the committee originally met today to determine whether you qualified for our executive development program. After everything we have seen and heard, I believe the decision should be unanimous. He looked around the room. One by one, every executive nodded. Even those who had doubted her only hours earlier now smiled with quiet respect. The chairman spoke first. On behalf of the hiring committee, I would be honored to welcome you to Whitmore Dynamics. Elena stared at the offer letter without touching it. Thank you, she whispered. This means more than you know. Graham smiled. There is one condition. She looked up surprised. You must promise never to lose the qualities that brought you here today. A gentle laugh spread around the conference room. Elena answered without hesitation. That is the easiest promise I have ever made. 3 weeks later, she walked through the same front doors wearing a simple navy business suit and carrying the same worn leather tote. The marble floors looked exactly as they had on interview day, except this time there were no muddy footprints behind her. The receptionist immediately recognized her and stepped around the desk with a bright smile. Welcome back, Miss Mercer.
Elena smiled.
Thank you. And thank you for treating me kindly that morning, even when everything was chaotic. The receptionist laughed softly. I have thought about that day more times than you know. Elena quickly became known throughout the company for something that had nothing to do with her job title. She learned names before positions. She remembered birthdays. She thanked the overnight cleaning crew every morning because she was often the first person to arrive. When a new intern accidentally spilled coffee across an important presentation minutes before a meeting, Elena stayed beside him helping rebuild every slide instead of allowing him to face the embarrassment alone. Word spread quietly through the building. She never asked for recognition. She simply noticed people others overlooked. Graham observed all of it without interfering. Sometimes he found her helping another department prepare for a company event. Other times he found her eating lunch with employees who usually sat alone. Every observation confirmed what he had believed from the very beginning. Character was not something Elena displayed only during interviews. It was simply the way she moved through the world. Their conversations gradually became longer. Sometimes they met in the company cafe before work. Sometimes they crossed paths after late meetings while the city lights shimmered beyond the office windows. They rarely discussed profits or quarterly reports. Instead, they spoke about family traditions, favorite books, childhood memories, and the small moments that quietly shaped a person's life. One evening, after a leadership workshop had ended, Graham asked, "Do you remember something you said during your interview?"
Elena smiled.
"I said a lot of things that day. You said working somewhere that makes you afraid to be yourself is another kind of poverty." She laughed softly. "Did I really say that?" "You did." Graham looked out across the Chicago skyline. "I have repeated those words in 3 executive meetings already." Elena shook her head with amused disbelief. "Then I hope they sounded wiser coming from you." Graham smiled. "They sounded wiser because they came from you first." Months passed, and Elena's ideas began influencing projects far beyond her original department. She suggested creating a volunteer day where every employee, including senior executives, would spend time serving local community organizations together, instead of attending another corporate retreat. Some leaders questioned whether it would be worth the cost. Graham approved the proposal immediately. The event became one of the company's most meaningful annual traditions. Employees returned with renewed purpose, stronger relationships, and a deeper understanding that success meant more than quarterly numbers. As the months unfolded, Graham realized something quietly remarkable had happened. He no longer looked forward only to successful meetings or completed projects. He looked forward to seeing Elena walk into a room because she somehow made every place feel lighter simply by being herself. And for the first time in many years, the billionaire who had built an empire through discipline and careful decisions found himself facing one challenge he had never expected. He was no longer trying to decide whether Elena Mercer belonged in his company. He was trying to understand when she had quietly become the person his own heart searched for at the beginning of every day. 1 year passed almost without either of them noticing. Seasons changed outside the windows of Whitmore Dynamics, projects were completed, new employees joined the company, and Elena quietly became one of the most respected leaders in the executive development program. She never asked to be treated differently because of the day she first walked through the front doors. In fact, she worked harder than anyone expected, believing that every opportunity should be earned again each morning. Graham admired that more than he could ever explain. On the anniversary of her interview, he invited the executive team to gather in the same conference room where everything had begun. Elena assumed it was another leadership meeting. As she stepped inside, she immediately noticed something unusual. The presentation screen was dark. Fresh flowers stood near the windows. Every member of the hiring committee who had interviewed her a year earlier was already there, smiling as though they were waiting for a special guest. Graham stood beside the conference table, holding a small wooden frame covered by a white cloth. "Miss Mercer," he said warmly, "1 year ago you believed this room would determine your future. The truth is that you changed ours instead."
Elena Smilet y.
"I only accepted a job." Graham shook his head gently. "No. You reminded an entire company what kind of people we wanted to become." He slowly lifted the cloth away. Inside the frame rested an old pair of navy shoes, carefully cleaned but still marked by faint brown stains that would never completely disappear. Beneath them sat a small brass plaque engraved with a single sentence. "Character arrived before success." Elena covered her mouth. With both hands, she recognized the shoes immediately. They were the same pair she had almost thrown away after that rainy morning. She had forgotten they even existed. Graham looked at her with quiet affection. The employee coordinating our office clothing donation recognized the shoes from that unforgettable interview and contacted my office before they were collected. A few people laughed softly through misty eyes. "Those shoes remind me every day that leadership is not measured by polished appearances. It is measured by the choices we make when nobody expects anything in return." Elena felt tears gathering despite every attempt to remain composed. "I never imagined anyone would remember those shoes." Graham smiled. "I never want this company to forget what they taught us." He stepped closer until only a few feet separated them. "There is something else I have wanted to tell you for a very long time." The room became perfectly still. "The morning we met, I believed I was evaluating a candidate. Somewhere along the way, I realized I had been learning from her instead." Elena looked into his familiar blue eyes, remembering the quiet man who had offered her a cup of coffee when everyone else had seen only muddy clothes. Graham reached into his jacket pocket and removed a small velvet box. He opened it slowly, revealing a simple diamond ring that reflected the afternoon sunlight. A gentle gasp spread across the room. "Elena Mercer," he said softly, "you taught me that kindness is never an interruption. It is the foundation of every meaningful life. You reminded me that success without compassion is empty, and that the strongest leaders are the ones who never stop seeing people before positions. I cannot promise there will never be difficult mornings ahead, but I can promise that I would like to walk through every one of them beside you. Will you marry me?" Tears finally slipped down Elena's cheeks as she laughed through her emotion. "You know," she whispered, "this is the second most surprising interview I have ever had." Laughter filled the room. Graham smiled. "Is that a yes?" She nodded without hesitation. "Yes. It has always been yes." Applause echoed throughout the conference room as Graham gently placed the ring on her finger. Months later, They celebrated their wedding in a quiet garden surrounded by family, close friends, and many employees who had become part of their extended family. There were no extravagant displays of wealth, only genuine laughter, heartfelt conversations, and gratitude for the unexpected path that had brought them together. Near the entrance stood the framed shoes, now accompanied by another small plaque that every guest paused to read before taking their seats. Sometimes the mud on your shoes tells a more beautiful story than the shine on your suit. Years afterward, new employees still heard the story during orientation. Not because the chief executive officer had fallen in love with one of the company's leaders, but because everyone deserved to remember that greatness often arrives wearing ordinary clothes, carrying quiet courage, and leaving muddy footprints that lead straight to the heart. If Elena's unforgettable journey reminded you that true character always shines brighter than appearances, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who believes in kindness, and subscribe to Chosen by Love for more heartwarming billionaire romance stories filled with hope, unexpected love, and inspiring life lessons. Thank you for watching, and we cannot wait to share another unforgettable story with you in our next video.